Well, thank you, Alex, for that wonderful introduction. I am delighted to be here this evening to recognize my colleague, my co-pilot here, Naomi Beckwith, who's the Lewis Senior, Lewis family, Lewis Manilow Senior Curator. We're going to get it right at some point, which happened only 2 weeks ago, so we could not be more ecstatic. And of course, none of this would be possible without the superstar of this evening, and every evening in my mind, Howardena Pindell. So, if you haven't seen the exhibition, I feel it is truly an extraordinary journey into Howardena's life and work. And this is our fourth or fifth iteration of this dialogue that we're having together. So excuse us for using shorthand from time to time. We'll allow the images to simply scroll and talk very freely and organically amongst ourselves, and eventually open it up to you, the audience. First, I'd like to start by just asking Howardena, early influences and the beginning. We start in 1967, though we know it happens much earlier. Could you talk a bit about those early years at Boston University and then the shift to Yale?
Okay, I was a figurative painter. Boston was a very conservative community, and I attended it from 61 to 65, excuse me, to get my BFA. And Boston, at the time, although they were not segregated, you could go to a restaurant and be told to leave because you were not white. It's still a little tricky in Boston, but... and I understood from, I don't know if you know the African-American artist Richard Yard. He was in graduate school, and so at the school, and he later told me many years ago that the university, the School of Fine Arts, had a quota of one black person a year. They also had a quota of one Asian person a year. So the environment was actually mostly women, white women, but the men kind of received the support and accolades of the staff. I would say that those were difficult years. First of all, because Boston is so grim and gray and cold. But yet there was the Isabel Gardner Museum, and I would spend a lot of time there. It was before someone stole the Vermeers. As a figurative painter, I would say that my parents really supported me. I started to take drawing classes in Philadelphia when I was 8 years old. And one of my teachers, Mrs. Ozer, called her in. I was in 3rd grade, and she said, your child is very talented. You must take her to museums. You must have art classes for her to attend, and you must have her go to galleries, although then there were very few galleries. And you should introduce her to artists. And so my parents introduced me to both black and white artists, so it was a big shock for me when I went to New York after graduating from Yale, that the art world was so incredibly segregated, because that's not how I saw it as a child. I learned to draw very, very early, so that my figurative gifts, I think, really came because I had parents who basically believed in education on all levels. And I can remember my father, who got a degree in mathematics, would tutor young people for the SATs, and one of his students got straight 800s. Not me. Not me. But anyway, so the figurative was a carryover from Philadelphia, which was basically about Aikens. And then Boston, I just learned how to render form. so it was optically correct. But then when I went to Yale, my teachers at Boston stopped talking to me because Franz Klein went to Boston U, but it was like forbidden to mention his name because it was abstract. And they said, you're not going to stick to the tradition. And so they just stopped talking to me. Later on, Boston U gave me a distinguished graduate or bachelor student.
Alumni award.
Yeah, alumni award thing. And none of my teachers showed up. They were so pissed off. Anyway, so at Yale, I ran into Al Held, who scared the hell out of me. Also, let's see, Al Held, Turkoff.
Was Albert still there?
Albers was not there, but his protege taught the color course, and I learned a tremendous amount. And we also took courses, because it was the School of Art and Architecture, we took courses with the architects, so you could be around people who had like a whole different eye and everything. So I would say the Albers course really changed my point of view, and I was struggling with figuration. I was just having a really hard time with it because I started to become more like the skeleton in the show. That was when I started to loosen up. Abstract expressionism was also another way of seeing. And it just dawned on me, that orange skeleton, I used to come to New York from New Haven. I would march in the anti-Vietnam War marches. And for years I kept saying, why did I make an orange skeleton? Well, Agent Orange. I just hadn't thought of it. It was about Agent Orange. Anyway, so these kind of political things were in the work, but it took me years to be mindful of it. And then when I left, after I got my MFA and ended up in museum work, I found that I'm so used to natural light when you're a figurative painter, and I didn't have that. And so I suddenly became attached to the circle. One of the other graduate students, Nancy Murata, was playing with the circle, and it was a catalyst. It was something that snapped, And all of a sudden, I found myself taking templates and drawing circles and ellipses, and then, when I was signing the books upstairs, they were asking me if my hand was tired. I punch holes. I've been punching holes for years. So my right hand is like really strong. Anyhow, so I then, had this continuum of using the circle as a metaphor, almost for kind of something maybe about the cosmos, that the sun is round, the earth is round, the moon is round, and then you go into different cultures and look at how the circle functions, even in the world of spiritual practice. And one thing I think I never told you, there was something, or maybe I did, the Tao of Physics, where they had images from the cyclotron, that is colliding particles, and they make, in fact, I realize I'm doing a lot of spirals. For my last show, I had a number of spirals, and when they collide, they make these beautiful drawings, of the tracery of the particles as they bump against one another. So science, in a way, kind of inspired me visually, besides, going to museums and galleries and so forth.
And Howardena, you just so eloquently laid out this beautiful move from figuration to abstraction, what it means to work with forms and shapes, and this new language and visual language of science that's influencing your work. But I think something else incredible, sorry, that sound just went up. Something else incredible happened in your work at that time, and that is you were making something called paintings, but you weren't actually putting a brush to canvas. And you were making things called drawings, but you weren't doing these normal lines. And you're moving into collage. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you started to experiment with the very form of painting and drawing, too?
Well, it's kind of complicated. I mean, I was trained as a traditional oil painter, and when they taught oil painting, you were told to use lead white. No one said that lead would kill you. So, you know, I found that I had developed an allergy to both turpentine and oil paint, so I had to switch to acrylic, and that led me, I think, more quickly into abstraction, because you can do a lot more with acrylic because it dries so quickly. And I like to play with it in terms of embedding things in it. But I also think a side of me was very rebellious. And I remember in both Yale and at Boston U, collage was verboten. You know, you had collage in your design class, but it wasn't supposed to creep out of design into any other aspect of your work. Also, one of the things, well, Yale had a scary system, which would be a kind of critique or jury where you were in this enormous room by yourself with all the faculty, all male, and one secretary. And what was interesting is to see and hear, although the other students weren't watching, but we did talk about it, if a woman used red and white, it was called pink, and you weren't supposed to use it. If a man used red and white, it was considered to be red and white. So I kind of got, I don't know, I just felt really rebellious, and I decided to use collage, which was supposed to be a no-no, and I started experimenting with color, and that I thank Joseph Albers, God rest his soul, for all that I learned from his course. You know, so collaging became kind of a central theme, but I think I also have a rebellious temperament. No.
Soft-spoken, but rebellious. There's a wonderful image that's been scrolling, which is you in the 1970s taking a break from painting. Do you want to discuss how the paint was being applied onto the canvas?
Oh, right, you did ask that. Well, when I first started using the circles, I would draw on graph paper, and I would buy papers, hopefully archival, from Charette, which was an architecture supply store. And then instead of painting, I decided to spray. And so at the time, I didn't use a compressor. I bought one, I just sat there, I didn't use it. But at the time, you could buy cans of air that would propel through, oh gosh, it's kind of complicated. There was a jar and a straw, and then you would squeeze it like you would, you know, spray something. And so I would cut out, I used manila file folders, you know, the kind you use in the office, and I would cut strips, and then I would punch the strips, and then I have no idea why I did this. And I would glue them together, and then I would pin them to the canvas, you know, tack them, and then spray. And then I would spray layers and layers so that the paint was in the literal fabric. And I just loved seeing what would happen, because there would be a grid that would develop because of the way I would align the templates.
The circle and the square.
The circle and the square, right.
And you weren't just spraying paint, but you were also spraying things like perfume.
Well, yeah, later on, again, that would be a forbidden thing, you know, in the art world. I started attaching, I wouldn't wear the perfume, but I would attach it to the paintings. And then I started to think, you know, it's kind of unfair, because suppose I put a perfume that someone hates on the back of the painting. So now I'm thinking, for people who have work from that period, if you want to, choose your own fragrance and spray it on the back.
Every museum is frightened now. Every museum is frightened now.
Yes, the conservators will, that's for both.
That would be a conservation nightmare, right?
Well, and it's wonderful, because the earlier iterations are literally that, spray painting onto the canvas, stretched canvas, and then at some point you just decide to get rid of the stretcher altogether.
Well, the reason why that happened, there were two things. Textiles. The museum at the time had an exhibition on African American adornment and textiles, and the museum also sent me to Africa. I traveled with Lowry Sims, who was at the Met. Thank God we didn't go alone. Anyway, because the view of women in some places were pretty grim. But we traveled for a month and a half to both East Africa and West Africa, and I saw tremendous textiles, and I loved the flow of the loose cloth. So that's when I took the canvas off the stretcher. Also, you know, as an artist, I mean, it was almost like being a sculptor where they destroy their work because they have nowhere to store it. When you have, like I had these giant stretchers that were folding stretchers to try to telescope things down or move things into a smaller format so I could store them. But then you get overwhelmed if you're productive. So it was partly necessity, but also I was genuinely drawn to the flow of textiles.
Howardena, you just mentioned the museum. The museum sent you to Africa. And I'd love for you to talk about your professional life outside the studio. Because when you graduated from Yale, you didn't just work in the studio, but you had a job as a curator. And you were also working with other women to found galleries and museums.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. There was a core of, I think, about 5 white women who wanted to start the first women's cooperative. And they asked, in New York, yeah. And they went to a slide bank and found my work and invited me to join. I mean, I think it was probably attractive to them that I worked at the Modern, so I shouldn't, you know, discount that might be a part of the reason why they invited me. And I found there was like a certain kind of stress or how can I call it, like an annoyance that I didn't have as much time as they had because they all had husbands and they all had someone supporting them. And I remember at one point they came to the museum to pick it and called me up and told me, come down and join us. And I said, no, I don't have someone paying the bills. I have to pay the bills. I don't want to get fired. So there was this kind of animosity, and then one of the women in the group, and she still says it, you know, but it gets back to me. She says, Howardena doesn't know she's black. So, I mean, when you look at the tape upstairs, Free White and 21, it kind of grew out of the animosity that was within the women's movement. Some of the white women would say, please be cooperative, which basically meant shut up and stop talking about race. And I remember approaching one group, and I was told that race is another issue. We're talking about women. And I remember there was a dealer that had an exhibition that was 50% women and 50% men, but they were all white. And I mentioned this to one of the white women in the show. She said, oh, but we're women, you know? So there was a lot of kind of misunderstanding. And to this day, I mean, every now and then something gets back to me that someone who is supportive of African American issues or people of color is kind of put down for it. And I think that Trump has changed the narrative.
That's true. And just to clarify for the audience, what was the name of that women's cooperative?
Oh, AIR.
And what was the name of
that?
that?
I named the cooperative, actually.
Yes. And which still exists?
It still exists, yeah.
What was the name of the museum that you were working at?
You can do it.
Okay, I was at the Museum of Modern Art.
Where you were the first
African-American
African
curator
woman curator.
in 1967.
1967. Yeah. Thank you. No one has ever applauded me for working there. Usually it's like, you know, how did you get the job? You know, and literally I had one white woman say to me, you don't have to lie to me. What do you really do at the Modern? One of these days I'm going to write a book.
Well, and I think that's very interesting because I don't know for those of you who may have seen the New York Times article maybe 2 weeks ago, they were discussing diversity in mainstream institutions, even listing out institutions that had 17% or more diversity within their curatorial ranks. There were not very many, I should say.
The Modern was way down.
Well, I think Perez was 50%,
Exactly.
and then it went down from there. But it was eye-opening that in 2018 that we're still discussing something for which you were a pioneer in the late 1960s. And your hire, of course, prior to that was the subject of many different protests by artists who felt that there needed to be some authentic authorship within institutions when dealing with artists of color. So Howardena's groundbreaking moment there has really enabled people like myself and Naomi to come into these institutions. And so, but one pays a heavy price to be the first, nonetheless.
Well, yeah, it's just, I would run into animosity within communities of color because the feeling was that if you work there, you can open the doors and everyone can come in. I had a boss from hell, you know, and even though she would make me acting director of the department when she'd travel, she still called the shots. And I mean, it was a very kind of patriarchal organization. And I noticed whenever the United States got involved with another country, then we would start collecting art from that country. But they weren't collecting art from Africa, you know, or contemporary African artists, but they would collect art from Eastern Europe or actually Latin America. You would have, as the politics would flow, then somehow that's when certain, I mean, I trained a curator from Iran, you know, when we were involved with Iran. So there was like a kind of meshing of the government's concerns with the modern. In fact, there was a woman, and I can't remember her name, an art historian, who, Carol Duncan, I think her name was, she wrote about how the US museums were looking at abstraction and that it was a Cold War tactic to say, well, we have the freedom to do abstraction, whereas there was a discouragement for figurative art because this is what the Soviet Union does. So there were some progressive art historians that were looking at it, not from the point of view of visual culture, but the politics behind that visual culture.
So let's talk about the departure from MoMA, and because it begins to open a new chapter in your life and career.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about 1979?
Well, 1979 was not a good year. 1979, there was an artist named Donald Newman, who went by the name of Donald, who did an abstract show of black charcoal and paper, and he called it Nigger Drawings. And it was Artist Space, which was sponsored by the NEA and New York State Council for the Arts. So an acquaintance of mine called them up. She was one of the people that would do sort of resourcing for NYSCA, New York State Council of the Arts. So she would travel to different institutions. So she just called them on the phone. They didn't know she was black. And she said, why do you have this title? And the comment from the person was, well, charcoal is black and black is nigger. So a bunch of us got together, and it was a multicultural coalition of us, and went to Artist Space, and Artist Space called the police and locked us out. And then the second time we went back to them, they let us in. And what amazed me, and this is why I feel that I've had experiences with tension with white women, the head of the space was a white woman who eventually became director of Metropolitan Pictures, although I don't even know if that gallery still exists. But one of her supporters, another white woman, said, "How dare you come down here and tell us what to do? This is a white neighborhood." You know, and so this underpinning in the art world of the, in fact, they got expansion arts money, which was supposed to bring people from communities of color into the alternative space. They used it to bring in artists from Scotland. Because some people, think, well, we're diverse, we're Italian, we're French, we're German, we're Norwegian, whatever. Anyway, it just reminds me of a time that was difficult. And I noticed in the museum there's a certain kind of tension around me because they saw it as censorship. They did not look at the fact that women of all colors were censored, people of color were censored, indigenous people whose land we're on were censored. But this one guy does this show, and they were saying that I was like, who was that guy that was so awful in Congress? Helms?
Jesse Helms.
Yeah, they said I was Jesse Helms. what do you do with that? Anyhow, so I decided to leave the museum. My boss was from hell, and I decided I didn't want to continue, even if I was acting director. And Donald Cuspit, I don't know where I was, some social function, and he said, we have a job available. There is a risk you would come in as an associate, but you have to have tenure in 2 years rather than 6 years. And so I had like this small window. So he lived near where I lived, and he drove me to school, and at that point I had an exhibition in their gallery. And so an art critic joined us, and the head of the fine arts, how can I explain it? It was like the Fine Arts Center, the Stoller. His wife, he was an ex-Jesuit priest. She was an ex-nun, and she was on back medication, and she drove across the medium strip, thank God we were slowing down, into oncoming traffic and hit us sideways. And some people say, oh, sounds like it was an act of God, you know, having the nun and the priest. Anyway, whatever, whoever, whatever. And I ended up with a concussion. I still have a dent here, but I didn't die because there was a dear friend who made this very thick wool hat for me. And I had that hat on that day. And I got a dent, but I didn't, break my skull. And I was sitting sideways because with the VW bug, you couldn't sit. Thank God I was sitting sideways because I would have broken my pelvis. Anyway, so that totally changed my life, and it totally changed my work. And I started at that point, and that's when we got Free White in 21. And when I wrapped my head, that's about my head injury. Because I always wondered, why did I wrap my head, But anyway, it was about having that head injury. And it just changed my whole view of things, feeling like if I have any beliefs, I should really express them, like write them down, journal, talk about them, write about them, whatever, because you could wake up dead.
It's very true.
Yeah.
So there is a new urgency in your work, and I love the fact that even with your large-scale canvases, you seem to stop making gridded patches of canvas and sewing them together, but you started making strips, like bandages even, and sewing those together.
I think that comes from a fractured mind. That I had memory problems. I still have memory problems. I had face recognition problems. This was closer to the accident. I had a problem remembering people's voices, and the amnesia that went with it. So it was almost like, here's how my mind is. That would be the strip that's for real, a real postcard. And then you put one on the other side of it, and then you try to connect them. So it was like I was trying to mend my mind.
Which is interesting because the work up until that point is mostly called Untitled.
That's true.
And then after that, it's called autobiography.
Yeah.
Or they're called memory test.
Yes.
And the figure comes back in your work too. Can you talk to us
Yeah,
about how you come back to figuration?
Well, I think part of it was I was the body became really hard to deal with. I started using a cane, although I stopped after a while. Again, the memory issues, not remembering. I have to carry usually a little book, and I write things down. Now my memory's much worse. But anyway, ask me that question again. See, my memory.
I was wondering how and why the figure returned to your work after this accident in '79.
There are several reasons. One of them is, some of you may know of Anna Mendieta, and she was a dear friend of mine, and I personally truly believe that Carl killed her. It's the body in a crime scene that's being traced. In other words, when he pushed her out the window, she landed on the roof, and they would have traced her body. And that's what I would do with the canvas. I would lie down on the canvas and trace my body. But I didn't realize that it was a crime scene issue until someone mentioned it to me. This is what it is. And also I was trying to heal my body. I was trying to do things that made me aware of my body and now I'm just sloppy old, But I would trace my head, in the scapegoat painting, there's a little black silhouette of a child's head. That was my head. I mean, I would get weird things in my work, and I started getting freaked out about them because there were like premonition stuff in the work. But I remember I lay down, and this was 1990, and I traced my head, and it looked like a little child. And I painted it all black, and then this was way before Carol Walker. And I realized, like, I've never used silhouettes per se, and it was a very benign image.
This is the image.
Yeah, it was a benign image. You can see the child. It was very weird. There were other, in that particular painting, there were other, in quotes, premonition stuff in that painting. And that made me a little bit nervous, to continue using that. The figure, right now I'm doing mainly abstraction, and there's a large piece that I'm working on right now for the shed, which is a new installation space, enormous space. The piece is like 9 by 9, and it's about how, if those of you know about what happened to the Belgian Congo, King Leopold went in, and a lot of rich American families, Guggenheims, Rockefellers, Whitneys, you name it, profited from the plundering of the rubber from the Congo. And if you did not agree to work for them, they would cut off your hands. And they did other things that I won't even tell you about. Buy the book, it was horrifying. And then also Columbus, when he came to the Americas, thinking he was in the Americas, but he was actually in the Caribbean, and the Taino and Arawak Indians were told, if you don't bring me gold, I will cut off your hands. And then in one of the school newspapers at Stony Brook, I mean, this is kind of dangerous to talk about, but apparently our Marines went into Haiti, and anyone who was rebellious, they would cut off their hands, shoot them, and throw them into mass graves. And I heard about that through my school's newspaper. One of the students wrote about it. But anyway, the painting will have text, and we've been cutting out. I think we probably have cut out by now, to cover all that space, we've probably cut about 600 or 700 hands out of using both rice paper, so like the hands that, will be like ghosty in the distance, and then a wove paper on top. And then I'm going to have 3D prints made of casts. A number of us are going to get together and cast our hands using silicone. If you've seen silicone, it's like wiggles. It's really weird. And it's very precise. You can see the whorls on the fingers in the casting. So I will have that in front of the painting, and then I bought a giant bucket, and that will be filled with blood. However, my dealer did not like the idea of real blood. So I looked on Amazon and found stage blood. So it's going to be filled with stage blood. I promise, Garth, it'll be stage blood. Anyhow, so that's one of the pieces. There's another piece I want to do, which will be mainly a projection. In fact, I just found out today that the woman whose home I was in, she was a dear friend. I was invited to dinner. I think I sometimes would stay over. And the mother was cooking meat, and I was just leafing through Life magazine, and in it was a horrific picture of a man who had been lynched, a black man, and he was on like almost a cross on the ground, and he was burning from the inside out, and the whites were running around like this is the Christmas, like this wonderful thing. So I had that smell, and then the visual, and it was like, oh my God, it was like I was there. So I'm producing a room where we're trying to find that image, and I'll have to deal with the copyright stuff to see what it involves. And I'm going to project that image in a dark room with the word castration, because what they would do is cut off your ears, cut off your genitals, cut off your nose, whatever, and use it as a kind of trophy. I'm going to jump to something because it's contemporary. Harry Potter, the elves were slaves. And when the slaves died, when the elves died, they would cut their heads off and put them as trophies on the wall. And the whole underpinning, Hogwarts has slaves. Those are the people who, cleaned, prepared the food, whatever. And it's a narrative that's there in Harry Potter. And at one point, Harry Potter, I've read all of them, at one point, Harry Potter mocks Hermione because she starts a free the slave movement, free the elves. And he put her down for it, and so did the man she eventually married, which was the young guy with the red hair that was Harry Potter's friend. But the movie people changed it, because in the last Harry Potter movie, you have Harry Potter cleaning the grave of one of the elves who had saved him. That was not in the book, okay? But anyway, the whole slave narrative is, anyhow. Remind me what I was talking about.
We're talking about the shed.
We were talking
Oh,
about
the shed, okay. So, all right, one of the things they did during slavery was slave captains, sea captains, would, because some of the crew were rebellious because they didn't like being on a slave ship. So what they would do is hang either a captured African or one of the crew over the edge of the boat. They would just stick them out, and the sharks would eat them from the head up. So I want to have a room that has like silk or something, but then have it wavy and have the sharks just swimming around in it. And so, I mean, you walk into it and you see these huge sharks. And then I haven't figured out how I'm going to approach the text, whether it will be text on the outside of the wall or a handout, whatever. Another media room I want is to show how during the Civil Rights Movement, when the children protested, I think in Birmingham, Alabama, and they were met with high-powered water hoses, it blew off their skin. We don't hear about that. I mean, we do if we, dig deep in reading and stuff. But anyway, so those are some of the things. I also want to have one painting which is about how progressive Black communities who survived and prospered, some were called Black Wall Street, how the whites would come in and burn them down and kill as many people as they could. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood in Florida, and I'm going to include Black churches as well. And I will have wood. One of my assistants is going to find a fireproof place where we can burn wood. And have that either, I'm not sure whether I'm going to attach that to the canvas or just have it at the base, but have all the names of the different places. They even, at one point, there were airplanes that would fly over some Black communities. I guess they would be little propeller planes, and they would drop gasoline bombs on top of the homes in order to destroy them. So
that happened in
that's why I'm doing abstract work,
Yeah.
because I need balance. I need to see something beautiful because the other is so horrifying.
Well, and I think that's an interesting segue because so much of your work is done in parallel tracks. Some of the abstract painting, but also the works on paper, the activist works that you create. And in the same vein, you're also, on the other hand, creating this very abstract, beautiful, non-figurative works that are about form and about color. And so that balance, which is always there, is very interesting.
Well, I need it for my mental health, because it's really hard. I mean, I have to just take it in doses, small doses, some of the political work, because it's so horrifying when you see, and then when you see what's happening in the world, just one kind of, when we deal with what's going on the southern border with separating the children, they were not allowed to touch. This is New York Times covered it, and not allowed to touch. They could not hug each other, and they could not use nicknames. And yet, at the same time, Russian women, this is on NBC, you can Google it, Russian women were coming into Florida and pregnant and without their husbands or whatever, and they would stay at Trump condominiums, and the goal was to have babies with American citizenships, and that would also give the mother the opportunity to get a green card or a visa, or perhaps even move here. And the question was, who are these children going to be loyal to, Russia or to the US? So you have this stuff going on, and the women from the Russian side of it are having a great time. It's called birth tourism. And then look what's happening to the children who've been separated from their parents, and to have their parents deported and have no idea where they are, and then to have these children in limbo to create a whole group of orphans.
It's true, and I think this dispels this sort of notion that artists are somehow hermetically sealed within their studios. Artists are citizens of the world, and as Howardena has indicated, utilizes their voice and their talents toward shining a light and reflecting the ills of society. I want to use this as a segue to sort of broaden the conversation and open it up, so we have some questions from the audience or like to expand the conversation. We can do so now.
I actually have a question from the audience that was offered to you before while we're waiting for someone to speak up from the audience. And someone asked, Howardena, how would you compare the art programs of Boston University and Yale today? And I can't quite read all of it, but basically they were wondering if you see the differences, any differences between, in the programs between your time there in the 60s and now.
That's a hard one because I haven't been back to Boston for ages. I did send the catalog.
They have 2 copies, so did I.
They have, and Yale, I mean, Yale was different then than it is now. I mean, this art school is still right at the top, but when I went to Yale, there were no women undergraduates, only graduate students, and it was tricky finding a ladies' room, where you could be in a class of, because we took some of the undergraduate art history classes, and the professors would say, because I'd be the only woman in the audience, lady and gentleman. So you would run into funny things like that. It's much different now. I did teach at Yale for about 5 years as a visiting professor while I was teaching at my other place, which meant I was exhausted. But the school has separated from architecture. Yes, the School of Architecture is by itself. The School of Painting and Drawing and Printmaking is separate, and sculpture has a separate building. Before, we were all together. Graphic arts, also, we were in the same building, but that's not true anymore. So it's changed a lot. And I haven't seen the new facilities. They've asked me to come down in November to, I assume they want me to do crits and do a lecture or something.
And what did you learn from being in a school where all those programs were integrated?
What was it like?
What did you learn in particular?
Oh, I learned a lot, because you saw different sensibilities under the same roof, and I'm sorry that they have split them, because I learned a lot being around architects who were up night after night after night after night to see what that profession was like and how underpaid they were when they would, be in that world as working people. It's hard to explain. Just knowing that if you wanted to wander into sculpture, you could to see what they were doing without leaving the building, or you could wander down in the basement to graphic design, and we took photography together. And I learned how to develop film, black and white though. Later I learned how to develop color, but it was a nice community feeling of the arts per se, but now it's all so highly specialized. So when I go there in November, I will be basically around the painters, drawers, and printmakers.
With all your rebellious sensibilities.
With all my rebelliousness, yeah.
We have a question from the audience.
Good evening. Thank you for coming to Richmond and speaking with us this evening. That was actually the perfect segue to my question. Who are some young artists that you're excited about their careers that we should all be checking out and encouraging VMFA to bring here?
Well, it's kind of complicated because as I got old, I had so much to do. I started a file because I want to keep up with them. I have not kept up with them, just simply because I was overwhelmed. One of the things I want to do is to talk to the Studio Museum and try to get their list of artists who've gone through their residency program. There's a wonderful artist for those who are sculptors, Chakaya Booker. She is really fantastic, and she is showing with Pace, which is a really tough place to show. I mean, I always think of Pace Gallery as a place where you do the art and they make the money, and you do the art and they make the money, and you do the art and they make the money. Anyhow, I like Fred Wilson a lot, but he's probably more well-known than many. Oh my goodness. I like some of Betty Starr's work, although she's old. She's older than I am. Her birdcage pieces I like a lot. I'm trying to think, what other young people? Kerry James Marshall, I like his work. Oh, I'm embarrassed to say I've just let it slide because I've been kind of overwhelmed. But I think keeping in touch with the Studio Museum's residency program will introduce you to a lot of, I don't know, they bring in 3 or 4 people.
Is it
at a
3?
time.
3 people.
3
every
people
year.
at a time.
I used to manage the
Yeah.
program.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, good to know. I just wish they had a library or an archive that one could go to.
You guys
Maybe.
have it, but there is.
Yeah, do they?
Yeah, it's not open to the public, but you can
Oh, okay,
request.
maybe I'll call them and,
And all the residents are listed on the website.
because I really, oh, good, that's good. Okay. So then go to the website, Studio Museum in Harlem.
I think I have a smaller question. I noticed that you use baby powder a lot in some of the work. How did you use it? Did you use it for the fragrance? Or did
No.
you use it as a binder?
I used it because I couldn't stand the patina of acrylic. And when
It was too shiny.
it's too shiny, too plasticky, or I make it really shiny with glitter. I don't like using it anymore because I understand that the talcs aren't that safe. So that my constantly using it it's a health hazard. I wanted to use baking powder, but one of my assistants, Jasmine, said to me, the powder is very acidic and might disintegrate the paper. So at this point, I've stopped using the powders. I was thinking of using, I'm afraid to use foodstuffs because the bugs will eat it. I used to have birds as pets, and you have a big mouse problem when you have birds because of the bird seed. And I found that they actually ate half of a book. So I'm very careful with rodents. I don't have pets anymore, but when I did have the birds, I mean, literally, you know, I had a book which is a timeline of history, and half of it's eaten up.
But that small question actually leads to a bigger point. So if I may, I'd love to ask a follow-up, which is you've been very careful in particular about materials. And so we laugh when we say foodstuffs may be eaten, but that's a real concern. And so
Well-
can you tell us about how you even
Yeah.
made some of these works so they can last all these decades?
Well, I think being in a museum helped me see what happens to work as it ages. And it's also something I brought up, I think, earlier today. I was talking to someone, whatever, that digital work will not last. It lasts maybe 20 years, and the technology keeps changing. Think of all those wonderful floppies you had back in the 19-whenever, when they told you back up your stuff, and then they changed the technology. And so you're constantly having to either update or you just lose all of it. We had our graduate students at first produce hard copy thesis, and then they wanted them to only do digital, and they found the digital material moves around or disappears. So now, now they have to do both digital and hard copy.
But what about your work?
My work.
Why is it that those hole punches don't fall off after 40 years?
Well, they're
most of them are
remarkably,
there.
Most of them
Most
are
of them are
there.
still there.
Yeah.
remarkably
Well,
fresh.
the adhesive I used for this particular piece with the numbers, I used acrylic medium. acrylic medium is a very stable adhesive. And I noticed there's no yellowing, there's no crumbling of the paper. It works. But now I've been introduced to jade glue and something called Elvase. And the company that has our archival adhesives is called Talas, T-A-L-A-S. They're in, I think they're back in Manhattan now. Or you could just Google them and find out about them. But it's very important to use archival materials. For example, I use cotton duck. I mean, linen's a little bit too expensive. And I realized that acrylic seems to have a pretty good lifetime. And of course, oil does, but then you have to be careful what you do with oil, just simply because if you're going to use oil, I really recommend not to use acrylic gesso with oil, but to do it the hard way. Basically mix titanium and zinc white and use rabbit skin glue for the base. But I like rabbits. So I kind of feel guilty suggesting that. But when we go to the museums and we see paintings that have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, I mean, it's so impressive. It's so impressive. And yet, you know, you walk by an Anselm Kiefer and another part of the campus falls on the floor, you know. So, you know, I really believe in longevity of the works of art for future generations out, because paint and canvas, no one's changing that technology. You know what I mean? In other words, if you want to be a digital artist, you have to have enough money to keep updating your work. And then when you die, you have to have people who will continue to update your work. So you know, there was like a war in a number of art departments between digital and a hard copy, or analog is what I call it. And in my department, we had there was a fight because the digital people wanted to take away painting, drawing, and printmaking. They said the computer could do the drawing. And all the students that majored in digital media without taking any drawing, all they could do was draw cartoons. So analog won, thank God.
I think we have, I think we have time for one last question. Yes.
Hi, as someone that's pretty critical of institutional spaces, but still actively engages with them and believes in the scope of what they can do, I just wanted to ask, how has your relationship with institutional spaces changed over the course of your career with your work or earlier work that might have initially been considered too radical or rebellious, like you have mentioned, is now like accepted and embraced? Do you worry about how your voice could be changed?
Okay, can you repeat, because I didn't hear it all.
Oh,
Yes.
No, it was kind of breaking.
If I may paraphrase, she's
Yeah, yeah.
asking about your relationships with institutions. You have been critical of institutions while at the same time working with them. You have written about a lack of diversity, but you're showing them.
Well, it's
is that a fair
come
paraphrasing?
today,
Yeah.
how you are now being embraced by the very institutions that you would have been critical of. So what is
Well,
your
it's-
relationship?
I consider it, I mean, some of the work I did change things. There was a show at the Brooklyn Museum called We Wanted a Revolution. And in the catalog, they published the paper that I had prepared for a conference, and it showed the statistics of museums and galleries. And for some reason, it's just, okay, all the museums that I criticize them have a whole new crew of staff. In other words, the older generation is now retired, and I think the new generation on staff are far more progressive. And so I'm not relating to the old generation. They're gone. They've either passed away or they're senile or whatever. So I'm not seen as a threat, you know, because those institutions like the Whitney, I hated the Whitney. A lot of people didn't like the Whitney. They only showed white male artists, you know? And I didn't like the space at all. And now the Whitney's fantastic. And they got into trouble. There was a piece that had to do with, I think it was Steve Biko, and a white artist, without explanation, used it as subject matter, and they really got into trouble.
Yeah, that was the Emmett Till.
Emmett Till, it
Yes.
was Emmett Till,
Yes.
right. Reminds me of Steve Biko, but anyhow, and so the artist had to place a statement next to the work saying that she would not profit from it, that she would not sell that image. But the museum, the old museum, when there was like a Carol Walker show and there were people who put on the blog that they were, upset or hurt by the work, the museum they censored them, they took it off the blog. And so what happened with this one particular guy, he then did a website with his comments. So I think the whole climate has changed. And I think under Trump, we are very lucky he's not interested in culture.
Well, let's continue to hope that. Let's continue that wish. Well, I know that this institution has opened itself up to be a safe space where hard conversations can happen, and we're really delighted that this conversation could happen this evening. So thank you, Howardena. Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you.